Welcome to the Negotiation in Real Life podcast. I'm your host, Nicole Davidson, and in this podcast, we'll explore the art and science of negotiation in real-world situations. Whether you're negotiating a business deal, asking for a raise, or trying to resolve a conflict with a colleague or loved one, negotiation is an essential skill that can help you achieve your goals and build better relationships. Through interviews with experts, real-life stories, and practical tips and techniques, we'll deep dive into the strategies and tactics that can make you a better negotiator. From understanding your own negotiation style, to reading body language, handling difficult conversations, and overcoming common challenges, this podcast will give you the tools you need to negotiate with confidence and achieve your objectives. So whether you're a seasoned negotiator looking to refine your skills or someone who's new to the game, join us as we explore the world of negotiation in real life. So, Matthew, welcome to Negotiation in Real Life.
Thank you very much for having me as a guest on your show, Nicole.
It's an absolute pleasure, Matthew, and we've had a couple of conversations before which have always been fun, so I'm expecting no less from today's. Before we get into our discussion on negotiation, perhaps you'd like to explain to the listeners who you are and what you do.
Absolutely, and first I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we're on. I'm here on Kaurna country, so I'd like to acknowledge Kaurna peoples and also the traditional owners of all country in this nation of Australia, because being a podcast, we've got people from all different lands, but all First Nations peoples and elders, past, present and future, I'd love to acknowledge, and everyone who is a First Nations person that might be listening today.
Fantastic. And I will also then acknowledge the Wurundjeri and the Boonwurrung people, which is the lands that I'm on today as well.
Thank you, Nicole. I'm definitely proud of my Aboriginal heritage, and I'm also really proud of my Greek heritage. My Aboriginal family belongs to the Gugutha peoples and also Narungga from York Peninsula in South Australia. I was born in Kaurna country, and I'm also a First Nations commercial dispute resolution lawyer, but I also do a lot of work negotiating contracts, negotiating deals and attending mediations. So I'm really pleased to be on this show to speak about some negotiation points and have a chat with you, Nicole.
Fantastic. And I'm really excited to have you because I think obviously you've got some really good general experience around negotiations from your work as a lawyer, but I'm also really interested. I haven't done a lot of work with the Indigenous community, and I'm really interested to learn whether there's some specific considerations that we should have as we are negotiating with people from the Indigenous community. So I think we'll get to that as we go through. One of the questions I always like to start with my guests is, you've had a career where you've been doing negotiation for some time now. Is there a negotiation that stands out for you as one that's been a really valuable learning lesson and that's helped you develop your current negotiation style?
Absolutely. And there's one particular negotiation, but it begins with a series of negotiations. So what happened was there was a series of negotiations that took place in a variety of related but different contexts with different organisations and different people. And through those negotiations, I was able to achieve really, really good outcomes. But then what happened is there was a negotiation that was sort of like the ultimate level of negotiation that stemmed from all these different negotiations. And all of those individual negotiations went exceptionally well. Mm-hmm. The reason why the culmination of this big negotiation sticks in my mind so well is because it was probably the most difficult negotiation that I ever had. It was difficult because each of the different people that were representatives of their own organisations in this bigger negotiation, they'd all carried a little bit of, maybe a grudge, a bit of heat with them as we were going into this bigger negotiation because of the outcomes that I was able to achieve in those earlier negotiations.
So is it fair to picture there that they'd already conceded some things along the way and perhaps they were feeling that they didn't get great outcomes themselves in those initial negotiations. Absolutely.
And those initial negotiations, I felt great that, we'd achieved a fantastic outcome from our side of things. But then when it came time for the bigger negotiation, when all the different representatives were all there together in the same room, I found it almost impossible to negotiate. And this one sticks in my mind so much because it was because of the series of events that led to this bigger negotiation. It was such a difficult experience where we didn't achieve an outcome at all. Nobody really achieved any negotiated outcome there. The lesson that I carried away from it was making sure that there's win-win outcomes through the negotiation processes. And it's never a winner-take-all attitude on a single negotiation. It's about developing relationships and being able to achieve outcomes that, are going to be great for a day, but also fantastic after that, and everyone's happy to do negotiations and work together from that point forward. It's not necessarily a winner-take-all approach. So that particular negotiation sticks in my mind because it was one that I learned so much from.
Such an important point, is it? The whole idea, you might get a great negotiation outcome for yourself, but if the person themselves isn't happy, then normally that will pop up in some form down the track, won't it? Either in your case, you have a subsequent negotiation that you can't get across the line, or sometimes it's people don't stick to the negotiations that they've agreed because they suddenly start to go, hang on, why did I even agree to that? That wasn't right. And now I'm going to not do it. So it's really interesting. How have you changed your negotiation as a result of that? Are there specific things that you do differently to those initial negotiations?
Sure. I think one of the things different as a result is focusing a lot more on the relationships with people rather than the actual result.
Yeah.
So I feel that a negotiation, if we look at the sort of way that lawyers typically see negotiations, it's typically I've got my client, you've got your client, and let's have this big heated battle and see who can, pummel the other lawyer and other party into submission. And really what I've learned through experience is that's definitely not the best way of having negotiations. I feel that the better way of having negotiations is by putting people first, by having discussions where you're actually able to open up negotiations by asking the right sorts of questions, and they are the open-ended type questions, and then the power of listening in a negotiation.
Yeah.
So that if we can listen to the other person and really feel what they want to achieve through the negotiation, really it can mean that sometimes they can have exactly what they want and you can have exactly what you want as well.
I love that. And I think, once again, you've talked about the importance of building a relationship. And I think one of the most powerful tools that we have available to us to build relationships is to genuinely listen to someone. We love feeling like we've been listened to. And so you're going to improve the quality of the relationship that you've got with someone just by that mere fact that you are actually listening and demonstrating that you're listening. One of the interesting things that I'm keen to explore a bit further with you there, Matthew, is, as you said, often it's lawyer and lawyer. What's your thoughts around the impact of whether the clients are in the room for those negotiations or not?
I believe that the clients should always, or mostly, I think that clients should have some involvement in that room, but also it depends on the context, right? So if, for example, I'm acting for a client that wants to have a good negotiated outcome, but for whatever reason, the other lawyer or the other party doesn't want negotiations to take place between parties. Instead, they might want negotiations to take place between the lawyers themselves. Okay, well, then that's the way it needs to be so that we can then negotiate an outcome and everyone can be happy from there. But I think that my preference is to have parties involved in that negotiation process, because I feel that negotiations can take place and achieve better results when there's trust that's built through the relationships and when there's honest conversations that are taking place where there's a true level of information sharing and everyone's understanding and listening to what the other people want in that negotiation can then lead to some really amazing outcomes. In fact, I was involved in a mediation recently where I was just absolutely blown away by my own client, who was a fantastic, she's an Aboriginal leader and she's amazing, and if she's listened to this podcast, she'll know who she is. But what was really incredible from the way that she dealt with a negotiation that was taking place in the mediation was, in the midst of a real heated legal battle where there were some real serious aspects, real serious allegations, she was able to really care and truly from the heart empathise with the other parties to the dispute. And her level of caring in the open forum, in front of a mediator, in front of barristers, in front of there's her real genuine level of caring and empathy meant that she made an offer in the process of the negotiations, and it really just blew everybody away. But it also meant that the dispute was resolved, whereas otherwise it might not be. And I feel that that's a great example of having parties present in negotiations and mediations.
I love that example.
Present, it really does mean that in a true moment of genuineness and heartfelt leadership, outcomes can be achieved, whereas if you've just got the black and white lawyer approach, they might not be achieved in the same way. And
absolutely. And you know, the number of times I hear people, well, you know, particularly lawyers in mediation, might turn around and say, let's just keep the emotion out of this. You know, I think we don't need to deal with the emotion, whereas I actually think that emotion is critical to getting an outcome, not only just to getting an outcome, but to the way that people feel about that outcome after the mediation finishes. And I think that's a beautiful beautiful example that you've given of that.
Exactly, because the negotiation's not scientific, right? I don't believe it is. I believe negotiations are really about people, and as people, we are emotional beings. So you can't really separate emotions from negotiations as a process. And I feel that a big part of a successful negotiation is by being able to really emotionally engage, connect, and care for one another in achieving outcomes from that emotional perspective and keeping those emotions in check. I think there's a bit of a dark side to this too, Nicole, to be honest, which is I was actually thinking about this because in a recent negotiation with a car dealership, I did need to shake the tree, so to speak, because sometimes when negotiating, if people are in a position of power and don't actually want to negotiate and don't actually want to be doing the right thing, I feel sometimes you do need to shake the tree a bit to achieve an outcome through the negotiation process. I love to think of that as the exception rather than the norm. Yeah. And I think the positive emotions are the best way to go. And so if we can achieve that as people and negotiators, that's the best.
Absolutely. And I generally say there's no always in negotiation. So you might have the preference of the way that you go, but there will always be an exception to the rule. That's the only always, is that there's always an exception. I'm interested, you talked about the car dealership negotiation and you know, my assumption for what you're saying is that the car dealer was in the position of power. Where did that power come from in that negotiation? Why were they the ones in the position of power?
Yeah. So I've done a fair bit of work for and against car dealerships, and there's some pretty strong protections, including under the guarantee provisions of the Australian Consumer Law. Mm-hmm. And often there's quite a small profit margin with cars, despite the higher prices some people pay for them. And when there's a car defect, it can become quite an expensive process for the car dealerships having to deal with defects and honouring warranties and the like. So most car dealerships have set up pretty good systems where they don't want to honour the guarantees that they're required to under the law. Instead, they'll often implement processes that people need to go through and part of those processes sometimes are about frustrating you know, obviously there's some good car dealerships out there and there's some good guys out there, and I'm obviously very much generalising. Yeah. But in this particular instance, the car dealership had their processes in place where they were trying to drive a buyer of a car down the garden path as they were trying to chase down the guarantees and get their rights on it because the car was leaking oil. And I was able to, through a phone call, speak with their main warranty mechanic and the manager there for the warranty repairs. And I really just articulated the fact that the whole situation could be dealt with friendly and everybody could, have a beer together at the end of the day. And I remember specifically using having a beer together at the end of the day just as a fun way of saying it can be a positive outcome for everybody.
Yeah.
Or it could get very argy-bargy and become quite legal, but it's not really what anybody wants. And so by putting the positive and the negative out there, he thought, I want to have the positive outcome. And so by putting those options out there and allowing and direct or guiding the right decision to be made, it meant that the car was fixed, the dealership was able to go on to other things, and the client was really happy with the outcome as well. So, sometimes by putting a bit of pressure, and that therefore it creates a bit of a negative emotion, sometimes that can be really helpful to achieve positive outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the interesting thing is what's fascinating about some of these situations is what I've heard you say there is the client really had a good legal case. From the perspective of should they have got what they wanted, it sounds like there was a pretty good case, but it's the cost of actually pursuing that puts the dealership into a position of power because they know that there's all these hoops and costs that the other person's going to have to go through and incur to be able to enforce their rights. And so therefore they can get away with putting in place those systems and processes that might make it harder and give them more power in those discussions. And it's,
sorry, you go.
I was going to say, that's one of my whole challenges with the fact that we use an adversarial process to resolve civil disputes because we're going straight into this combative process that doesn't necessarily encourage people to have the kind of conversations that you're talking about.
Absolutely. And this is where your skill set and the work that you do in not only negotiation but also mediation becomes extremely powerful because with our adversarial system and with our, well-crafted laws that are all in place, that's only part of the battle, isn't it?
Yeah.
Often it's quite easy for the bad guy to do bad, but then for somebody to actually achieve justice, they need to pursue the wrong and go through a whole big legal process, whereas sometimes a better, more efficient outcome can be achieved through proper negotiation earlier in the piece, whether that's in a mediation or whether it's some other form of negotiation. But negotiation can be a way of achieving really efficient, cost-effective and fair outcomes, can't it?
You are preaching to the converted, Matthew. Yeah. Absolutely. And I think that idea that you've said, it's about early intervention. Ideally the parties will negotiate for themselves with that positive mindset. And I think that would be great if everyone could do that. But I think often it's the lack of trust between the two parties means that bringing in that third person can smooth that process and get them further without necessarily needing to go legal in that process.
Exactly. Trust is such a massive piece, isn't it, to successful negotiations?
Absolutely. And that's, a lot of these people, by the time their disputes get quite big and they think it's time to do something, the trust is often diminished so much that the value of a third party to manage those conversations is huge. But I want to shift us along a little bit now because, as you said earlier, you've got a really interesting mix of Greek and Aboriginal heritage. I'm really intrigued as to what kind of negotiations went on in your household when you were growing up, if there was some interesting cultural dynamics going on there.
For sure, there was. I think I've experienced quite a ton of negotiations from being a young kid. So some of those were good negotiations to experience, and I think that what we experience as young kids and what we experience in the family home is often the grounding place and where we learn a lot of the skills that we can then apply later in life, right?
Oh, absolutely, without a doubt. And I think the interesting thing from negotiation perspective is, yes, there's those negotiations that you see on a daily basis in the home. And if you've got parents who are very collaborative and working together, as opposed to having parents who are fighting and screaming at each other, it's going to certainly impact your negotiation style. And then I think, unfortunately, the other place we pick up our negotiation skills is watching TV and Hollywood movies. And as I like to say, watching an interest-based negotiation is pretty boring, and there's not many of them make it onto the screen. But watching adversarial, hostile negotiations makes much better drama. So that's I think, when I ask people whether they like negotiation or not, a lot of people shy away from negotiation because they connect it with that sort of dramatized Hollywood version of negotiation.
Absolutely.
Coming back then, do you see any differences in the sort of, did you notice or were you aware of, now looking back, on cultural differences in the negotiation styles between perhaps aspects of your family coming from the different sides?
Yeah, I feel that when negotiating with Indigenous communities, when you're negotiating with Aboriginal businesses and Aboriginal organisations, the negotiations are often different because the interests are different. Mm-hmm. I think that one of the wonderful differences about Aboriginal peoples is the way that we look at community and each other as being first and foremost. And if you look at that, for example, in a business setting, I'm generalising here, but often you can have an Indigenous business. It's about generating profit and then creating the purpose for that profit after that, right? And often First Nations business, first and foremost, are about communities, are about people, and then looking at profit generated as a second piece.
Yeah.
All of that. And there's pros and cons of each of the models, but I feel that understanding the interest behind First Nations peoples is definitely a big factor, like all negotiations, right? By listening to the other parties and understanding what's driving them through the negotiation process, you can then look towards better outcomes. And so some of the interests that are a bit different than when you're looking at First Nations people does come down to the cultural issues, because culture definitely plays a big part of Aboriginal peoples, and that needs to be understood in the negotiation process. And also the respect for elders and leaders in First Nations community is a very big part of appreciating negotiations when working with Aboriginal organisations and Aboriginal leaders.
Yeah, and I'd love to come back to that bit in a second, but I just want to step back to what you were saying there about, in essence, you're saying that Indigenous businesses are more led by purpose than profit, as opposed to perhaps, let's say, other businesses being profit then purpose. And I totally, agree that a lot of businesses might tout a purpose, but ultimately, if the purpose clashes with their profit, it's kind of words, not meaning. Do you see non-Indigenous businesses taking advantage of that focus on purpose rather than profit to get worse financial outcomes for the Indigenous businesses than they might get if they were looking at it more from a profit perspective?
I think that what you're asking about here it really does touch on a subject that I'm really passionate about, which is the subject of black cladding. Black cladding is an example of what you're speaking about here, because there's a lot of drivers out there to do with First Nations businesses, because through closing the gap policies, First Nations business has been identified as a way of closing some of the metrics. I mean, there's greater percentages of First Nations, deaths in custody, incarceration rates, the percentage of First Nations health issues as opposed to non-First Nations health issues is drastically poorer, and there's a lot of issues. But business itself being identified as a way of closing the gap and achieving some positive outcomes in some of these areas has been identified, and there's a problem to do with black cladding, which is typically where you get a non-Indigenous business entity or a person taking unfair advantages of opportunities that should be for First Nations businesses, or otherwise dressing themselves up as being a First Nations business when they're not. And so there's some of it's an example there when you look at black cladding, where you've got some of the drivers and some of the impacts that do negatively affect Aboriginal community.
Yeah. So I'm intrigued in terms of this black cladding. Am I correct in assuming like an example of that might be where the business is already operating, they bring in an Indigenous person to the business in some role that might look like they've got an active role, but in fact they're just some sort of silent partner there to promote the business as having an Indigenous connection? Is that how that shows up?
Yeah, so it's sort of the most... Yeah, so one way could be having a completely non-Indigenous business that has a face of a First Nations person associated with the business, but that face is just there from a marketing perspective. So that's one. Two really common ways in which they arise is having a joint venture arrangement. So an incorporated joint venture. So you might have a company set up, and in that company you might have 51% of the shares with a First Nations person. But through that structure, the First Nations person doesn't actually have any real capability, decision-making power, any real control of the business itself. So there's that shareholding, but nothing else.
Yeah, so they've got different classes of shares going on and the voting rights all sit with the other party or something like that.
Yeah, sometimes, but also owning shares is not the be-all and end-all about what a business stands for. And really that 51% comes as a result of Supply Nation, which is a national entity that's there for First Nations businesses. And they've got a definition of an Aboriginal business, and one of those definition pieces is having Aboriginal ownership of at least 51%. So that's why it's structured in that way. The unincorporated joint venture model is another example, but there's situations where you have non-Indigenous businesses dressed up as being Indigenous businesses and then taking opportunities away, and this is typically where black cladding arises.
Yeah, really interesting. I know you're very passionate about this and do a lot of advocacy work trying to raise awareness and try and resolve some of those issues as well. Coming back, we were talking earlier about dealing with elders within the Aboriginal community and that sort of thing. So for somebody who was coming in to work with an Indigenous business who hasn't had any experience of doing that, what would be your top pieces of advice for how to build rapport and take into account some of the sort of cultural focus around elders and other things that they might need to think about when negotiating with an Indigenous business?
Sure. So I'd say that respect, listening, and being sensitive to culture are some of the key pieces there, because in most First Nations communities, there is a great respect for our elders, and the NAIDOC week was only a couple of weeks ago. Now that obviously draws an emphasis for our elders, but understanding the leadership position that our elders and Aboriginal leaders have, and then also being able to listen and learn and appreciate the cultural differences. I think they're some of the big pieces. If you're a non-Indigenous person working with Indigenous peoples and you need to represent them or negotiate, I think that listening and appreciation is a big part of all this.
Yeah, great. So I think what I'm hearing there is it's not necessary to be all across it before you come in, and there's not necessarily an expectation that you will understand all of the nuances of the Indigenous culture, but you've got to be curious and willing to learn. Absolutely.
And I think respect, listening and learning is a really big piece of all negotiations.
Absolutely.
With a First Nations person, First Nations organisation, or, a non-Indigenous person organisation.
It's a human desire, isn't it? It's one of our core concerns is to have respect and to be respected. So I think you're right, it is with everyone. Is there anything particular about how you demonstrate respect to an Aboriginal elder?
Sometimes it's really difficult to put things into words, I feel, because there's a presence, an appreciation and an honest, genuine listening that needs to take place. And, that cultural respect and reverence for elders, I think, is part of the answer.
Yeah, it is. It's fascinating. I think that's why some people might
kind of be a bit nervous going into some of these things because, as you said, if it's hard to put into words, it's sometimes hard for people to know what should they be doing. But I think if you come back, as you said, to those core issues of treat people decently with respect as humans, then it kind of all takes care of itself, because I think part of that is actually about being curious as to how other people want to be treated and treating them the way they want to be treated. And so I think if you go down that path, you're probably in a fairly safe place by the sounds of it.
Absolutely. And I feel that humility and honesty, if you're in an environment where you don't understand the cultural norms, you don't understand any of the cultural sensitivities that are involved, if a person can be genuine and honest and saying, look, they don't know the answers, but they want to learn, and they are there with the right positive attitude, with that level of respect and humility, then often, leaders and elders and Aboriginal people and even non-Aboriginal people in that sort of context will help a person come to speed. I think sometimes if a person goes into an environment with arrogance and thinking that they know everything, that's sometimes when they can fall short.
Yeah.
And something in this spirit that I always like to say to my clients, First Nations clients and non-First Nations clients, is I always like to work on that as a team, because I've been a lawyer, I was admitted in 2004, so approaching 20 years now. It's been quite a while. And to be honest, I always say that I learn new things each and every single day, and I'll never say that I know everything. And I always like to work as a team with clients, because I feel that clients can bring amazing input into a negotiation, and that can achieve great outcomes. The Aboriginal leader, a woman that I was speaking about before, as an example, but I also have that attitude because I feel that with humility, we can achieve better outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's so true. So, Matthew, I've had an absolute pleasure chatting with you on the podcast today. If people wanted to reach out to you, perhaps they've been interested in something you've had to say and want to learn more, perhaps about black cladding or other issues that you can talk about, what's the best way for them to get in contact with you?
Yeah, awesome. So LinkedIn's a great spot. I've got a pretty good LinkedIn profile. Then also, so just my name, Matthew Karakoulakis. Also on Instagram is the firm name, AMK Law. I've been giving Threads a bit of a go, which
yes,
a unique experience. Yeah, so you can reach out there. And we've got some stuff on TikTok. So all the social media.
You're everywhere.
We'd love to hear from people. But I think social media is interesting. I think it's interesting how there's different styles of communication depending on the platform.
Absolutely. Well, thank you once again for taking time. It's been a real pleasure having you on the podcast. That's all for this episode of the Negotiation in Real Life podcast. I hope you enjoyed our discussion and learned something new that you can apply in your own negotiations. Remember, negotiation is a skill that can be developed and refined over time, so keep practicing and pushing yourself out of your comfort zone. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can find us on social media or email us directly. And if you liked this episode, please leave us a review on your favourite podcast platform. It helps us to reach more people and continue to produce high-quality content. Until next time, keep negotiating in real life.